I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1781 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, we're going to talk about one of the most controversial ideas ever in U.S. foreign policy that had an effect on every Vietnam veteran. That policy was known as the Domino Theory. President Dwight D. Eisenhower came up with that name way back in the 50s. The theory says that if one country falls to communism, then all the rest of them nearby are going to fall to communism. That theory dictated our foreign policy for a long time. Vietnam veterans in particular should be very interested in this topic because it resulted in the creation of a black marble monument in Washington, D.C. with 58,276 names on it of people who gave their life in the Vietnam War, where we were all putting into practice the Domino Theory. After the Vietnam War subsided, the Domino Theory lost some of its popularity. But there are writers out there that say, wait a minute, not so fast. It may still be in effect. There was an interesting story in the Japan Times, or you may prefer the pronunciation Japan Times, that dealt with this theory. I'm going to share that story with you because I think it's very important that we stay up on these things. Because today we are seeing the results of people not being educated and what it can do. It appears we have a generation of Americans out there that do not appreciate their country because of their education. They do not know about this great country. It's kind of like you go out, you look at a big, fine house out in the country somewhere. Beautiful house. Built with all the best materials, and it is a pleasure to look at and to live in. But the younger generation today seems to be more interested in going out and popping the top off the septic tank and looking in there and saying, oh, this house produces dirty, nasty waste. They don't even look at the big house and see the good that it does. They have to look at these things. That's what I believe a lot of people in this oncoming generation are doing. Pardon me if I'm blunt here, but I think they're all stupid and they're going to pay a heavy price if they don't get some education. That's another reason I'm sharing this story with you that appeared in the Japan Times. Title of the story is China's Rise Heralds Return of the Domino Theory. This story was written by not just another lightweight columnist. Hal Brands wrote it. He's a Bloomberg Opinion columnist. He's also the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He's also a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. While he's not doing that, he's writing books. He wrote the book, The Lessons of Tragedy, Statecraft and the World Order. That's another reason to listen to this story. It was submitted by Hal Brands. Let's take a look at what Mr. Brands says about the Domino Theory. Dateline, Washington, D.C. Does momentum matter in global affairs? If one country falls to hostile forces, will others follow? The Domino Theory, the idea that setbacks can accumulate quickly and catastrophically, is one of the most controversial ideas in U.S. foreign policy. It guided a half-century of statecraft during the Cold War, only to be rejected by many historians of that conflict. It got it a half-century of statecraft during the Cold War, only to be rejected by many historians of that conflict. But the anniversary of the Korean War, which began 70 years ago on June the 25th, 1950, reminds us that the domino theory was rooted in key realities of international affairs. And it alerts us that domino dynamics can affect U.S.-China competition today. That's right, China has become the 800-pound gorilla in the room. The domino theory became infamous thanks to the Vietnam War, which the United States fought in part to prevent the rest of Southeast Asia from falling. U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower coined the phrase in 1954 in explaining why losing Indochina would be so disastrous. You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is it will go over very quickly. Beyond Vietnam, the idea that one defeat could trigger another's was ubiquitous during the Cold War. A principal reason U.S. President Harry Truman provided aid to Greece and Turkey in 1947 was fear that other parts of the Middle East and Europe would find it impossible to resist if the country succumbed to Soviet pressure or communist subversion. Can you believe there are people in this country today that want to turn this country communist? They are some poor, sick, ignorant fools. Continuing. The Korean War was fought on the same premise. If the U.S. failed to defend South Korea, the result would be demoralization and neutralization in Japan and Western Europe. In the 1980s, the U.S. waged a decade-long covert war in Nicaragua to prevent the Sandinista revolution from turning the rest of Central America red. The balance of power was fragile, American officials believed, and even a few cracks could cause it to shatter. Those looking back at the era have mostly taken a dimmer view of the domino theory, seeing it as sloppy strategic thinking or simply Cold War hysteria. But there was something to fear of falling dominoes, and Korea reveals why. Although we rarely remember it this way, the Korean War was part of a mini-domino effect. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communists won the civil war in China. That led to an intensification of Ho Chi Minh's insurgency in Indochina, which Mao's regime could now support. This also helped set off the Korean War by giving North Korean leader Kim Il-sung the backing of the Chinese government and helping persuade Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to give the green light. One communist advance did lead to others. There were other mini-domino effects elsewhere. When Vietnam fell in 1975, Laos and Cambodia went with it. The Soviets pushed harder elsewhere along the global periphery in places such as Angola. U.S. allies in Southeast Asia had doubts about Washington's staying power. In Latin America, the Cuban Revolution in 1959 incited communist insurgencies in countries throughout the region, in part because of the aid and inspiration Fidel Castro provided. Thank goodness Fidel is pushing up daisies now. Continuing. 2 decades later, the Sandinista victory in Nicaragua did not directly cause revolutions in Guatemala and El Salvador, where communist movements were leading movements against the highly repressive regimes. But it did increase the intensity of the violence in Guatemala and especially El Salvador, as the Nicaraguan government created a logistical hub for other Central American revolutions. As these samples showed, a communist takeover in one country would allow that country to put pressure on its neighbors through subversive or support for outright aggression. The domino theory simply reflected the psychological and geopolitical realities of competition in an interconnected world. To the extent that the feared mega-domino effect never happened, it was most likely because the U.S. and its allies invested so much in shoring up positions under strain, as Washington did in Korea in 1950. Those interventions weren't always wise. The U.S. war in Vietnam may have bought time for other parts of Southeast Asia, but the price in human and strategic damage was astronomical for America itself. The Korean War also turned very bad after the Truman administration's effort to liberate North Korea brought on Chinese intervention. The domino effect was real, but how to respond was still a matter that required good judgment. Sometimes good judgment can be in short supply. Continuing. Strategists in the new Cold War should pay heed. China may not be bent on outright conquest of its neighbors. It doesn't command the loyalty of communist parties around the world the way the Soviet Union often did. Yet, there are still domino dynamics that could affect key areas of the competition. Taiwan, for example. The island occupies a strange place in U.S. policy. Washington does not recognize it as a country, but has an ambiguous commitment to defend it from Chinese aggression. Some prominent analysts have recently suggested that simply allowing Beijing to reabsorb its renegade province would remove a major irritant in the U.S.-China relationship. But leaving aside the moral implications of such a policy, the geopolitical implications would be terrible. If China took control over Taiwan, it would undermine U.S. strategy throughout the region. The disputed Senkaku Islands would become far harder for Japan to defend. China would have a much easier path into the open Pacific. The diplomatic ripple effects would surely unsettle other exposed countries that depend on American power. Beijing would not be able to simply snap up the rest of the Asia-Pacific, even if it wanted to, but the loss of one crucial position would have the effect of endangering others. Something similar could happen in the realm of technology. Countries are currently deciding which 5G technology provider to use based not simply on economic and security considerations, but on assessments of whether the U.S. effort to stymie Huawei Technologies Company will succeed. As more countries, particularly major developed countries, allow Huawei to build their 5G networks, those that remain will see less point in bearing the cost, economic and diplomatic, of finding an alternative and displeasing Beijing. More broadly, if countries in the Asia-Pacific or elsewhere believe China is getting the upper hand in its struggle with the U.S., they will be less inclined to run the risk of opposing it. Lose in a few places, and people in lots of other places might think you can't win. This does not mean the U.S. should go all out to compete with China everywhere, just as it wasn't prudent to fight a massive land war in Vietnam. Some places don't actually matter that much. Victory in Angola did not bring the Soviets any closer to victory in the Cold War, and winning influence in some corrupt country in Central America or sub-Saharan Africa might not help China much in the long run. But global competition does have a way of bringing out the interlinked nature of the strategic environment and reminding us that what happens in one country may not stay there. That was Hal Brands' essay that relooks at the domino theory. There are still some things to consider out there. It's very interesting that this story would appear in the Japan Times. Japan is right up next to China. And as China gets stronger, they may get a little more nervous thinking about what they did to China when they invaded it. Little things like the rape of Nanking and other things. It could result in Japan rearming. And we know what Japan can do when they rearm. Take a look at Pearl Harbor. That's why these foreign policy issues are very important. We just have to pray to the good Lord above that we have smart enough leaders in this country to be able to guide us through these dangerous waters of international politics. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you very much for listening to this story. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, The Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?